Last week, I made a video about Japanese indie games, and in that video I said that Japanese indie games tend to evoke nostalgia better than Western indie games that only try to evoke nostalgia. And the reason I think that is because of the marketing environment that Japanese indies face. Over there, arcades and physical media never went away, and in a subtle way that encourages designs that do, in fact, feel a bit dated to someone used to something else. They combine elements that feel dated with elements that feel timeless, and so they evoke nostalgia. Meanwhile, outside of Japan, indie games have a choice whether or not they want to use retro aesthetics for theming. It's done for budgetary or stylistic reasons, and it's not as much of a requirement. There are lots of indie games that don't use a retro look. Going for rad chiptunes and pixel art and a fairly innovative game design makes it less of a retro game so much as it makes it a retro-themed game. After all, there's nothing from the 80s or 90s that really looks, feels, or plays like Hotline Miami, FTL, Fez, or even Retro City Rampage. Shovel Knight is one of the few exceptions. Its creators decided to imagine a world in which development for these 8-bit platformers never stopped, which isn't that far-fetched of an idea because in a way it never did stop. They tried to imagine how an 8-bit NES game would feel and play if developed today, and as a result you have an incredibly clever and playful game that uses its old-school outfitting to surprise you. It doesn't just take into account modern design accessibilities, but also modern expectations. It plays with cliches that we have grown used to. It takes unexpected twists and turns from familiar routes. You can have a boss fight break out in the middle of an item shop, or have an item shop appear in the middle of a dungeon. There are some platforming challenges that require you to change the lethality but not the location of obstacles. It gets really dynamic and surprising sometimes in weird ways. It's a crazy reunion party where 3 decades worth of game design cameos show up in what is essentially a big twist on Mega Man, with the DuckTales melee attack inside of a Super Mario 3 overworld map, with Zelda 2's friendly villages and downward thrust, and a whole lot of art assets that look like Castlevania. But there are also silhouette levels like in Super Meat Boy. There are a few parts where your gravity gets reversed to go up and down like in VVV or Thomas Was Alone. The death system is actually ripped straight out of Dark Souls. You suffer a currency penalty on death with you dropping that currency as retrieval. This does exactly what it did in Dark Souls. It encourages a slow and careful playstyle. It pushes you to spend money frequently, and it allows for the occasional exploratory suicide rush, since unlike Dark Souls, you only lose about a quarter of your currency on death. What doesn't work is when your retrieval lands in an unreachable spot. That doesn't feel intentional. Shovel Knight has a few flaws, it also has bugs, but it is otherwise a very tightly designed game that doesn't just wax nostalgic, but is active enough to add in a few new tricks of its own. Like the checkpoint system. You can destroy level checkpoints for extra cash. It's great for replays in New Game Plus. You get the option to take a little bit of extra gold in return for ramping up the stakes way higher. The tension gets heavy, and so does your wallet. It's a little unfortunate though that there isn't that much to spend all of that money on, just character upgrades. During your replays, you'll probably have all the upgrades you'll ever need from the previous run, which means you don't really have much of an incentive to destroy those checkpoints. But I still like that they thought of that. It's like a difficulty select menu that's activated inside the gameplay rather than outside of it. Because honestly, it seems like the checkpoints are placed thickly enough to make it a bit too easy by default. In true Mega Man fashion, your control scheme and actions are so straight and simple that it's the level design that makes or breaks the experience here, so we're lucky that Shovel Knight's level design is pretty darn good. Just about every new hazard is first placed in a safer zone where they're a bit neutered, so you can preview new enemy attacks before taking them on for real. Even the more unpredictable tricks and traps have a bit of visual flair to keep you on guard. They'll give you a healthy window for reaction, or they'll place ambushing enemies directly in the path of your attacks. Another really clever twist is that they gave that Zelda 2 downstab a bounce, so the game gets really creative about what can be considered a platform. You can lock bosses into combos or use enemies as stepping stones, and some enemies actually have counters built into them to keep you from relying on it too much. That downstab turns Shovel Knight himself and those levels into really bouncy, versatile things, which makes perfect sense since it's a platforming game. Using enemies as mid-air stepping stones isn't exactly a new concept, but it worked before foreign games that everyone remembered loving, so they might as well throw it in the nostalgia pile. Nostalgia is Shovel Knight's theme. It doesn't rely on referential humor, and the retro visual style is not just skin deep. Shovel Knight was built from the ground up to seem dated, but not to feel dated. They didn't get as hardcore with limiting themselves to antiquity as, say, La Mulana did, but they did develop this game in full awareness of the NES's own limitations. Shovel Knight takes pixel art that is actually in HD and scales it to match the same vertical resolution as the NES, but the horizontal resolution is extended to fit modern monitors. The music was made with software that recreates the exact same noises an NES can make, but they opted to emulate the more advanced VRC6 sound chip that was only used in Japanese versions of later Konami Famicom games. The artists stuck to the NES's original 54-color palette, except when they snuck in 4 extra colors that just had to be necessary for a few very specific scenes. There are technically more backgrounds, more sprites, more frames of animation, and more music tracks than an NES cartridge could possibly store. And of course, you have 9 different slots for game saves, and they're saved on the cloud on the internet. They took just enough liberties to make something that doesn't actually look like an NES game, but rather what you remember an NES game looking like. After all, that is what nostalgia is about. Nostalgia is sentimental, it's wistful, and it's about remembering only the things you want to remember. Presumably happy thoughts. Maybe that's why everyone in Shovel Knight is so smiley and cheerful. Maybe that's why the music is so upbeat, light, and fast. Maybe that's why the checkpoints are placed so frequently. It's less of a game about hardcore platforming challenges as much as it is a game about nostalgia. Shovel Knight isn't just a particularly faithful retro platformer. It has enough personality, humor, and charm of its own that it would have worked just as well had it come out any other time. The art, the music, and the gameplay is good. It is of a timeless quality. If it was a NES game, it would have clearly been one of the better ones. But it's been almost 3 decades since those days, so Shovel Knight daydreams about them. It looks back on them fondly, and it filters out the bad memories while embellishing the good ones with good modern ideas that did not happen back then. It is one of the best games about nostalgia.